Picture this. Florence, 1968. The Renaissance city that gave the world Michelangelo's David and Botticelli's Venus was about to become the hunting ground for one of Italy's most terrifying serial killers. What began as a single, brutal murder would evolve into a decades-long nightmare that would claim multiple lives and transform the romantic Tuscan countryside into a landscape of fear. Welcome to Serial Killer Files by Skoob, and to the chilling true story of the Monster of Florence. A case so complex, so twisted, and so deeply embedded with conspiracy theories that it continues to haunt investigators and residents alike. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and over the next hour, we'll journey through one of Italy's most infamous unsolved mysteries, where nothing is as it seems, and the truth remains as elusive as the morning mist over the Arno River. The year was 1968, and while the world was experiencing cultural revolution, Florence was witnessing the birth of something far more sinister. An unknown assailant armed with a distinctive automatic pistol, a weapon manufactured in Australia during the 1950s, claimed his first victim. This wasn't just any murder. It bore the signature of what would become one of Italy's most notorious serial killers. The first victim was a woman, and unlike the horror that would follow, she did not suffer the sexual mutilation that would later become the killer's macabre calling card. This initial murder established a pattern that would terrorize the region for years to come. The attacker targeted couples and individuals, luring them to secluded areas before striking with deadly precision. But here's where the story takes its first mysterious turn. After this brutal beginning, Florence experienced an eerie calm. For 13 long years, the city held its breath, unaware that the monster was simply waiting, planning, preparing for the carnage that would follow. Then, on June 6, 1981, the silence shattered. Giovanni Foggi, 30 years old, and Carmela Di Nuccio, just 21, became the next victims in what would become a reign of terror. But this attack was different, more savage, more symbolic. Di Nuccio was stabbed over 300 times, and in a detail that still sends chills down investigators' spines, a severed grapevine was found thrust into one of her wounds. Breaking his own established pattern, the killer struck again that same year in September. Stefano Baldi, 26, and Susanna Campi, 24, fell victim to the monster's fury. The female victim suffered post-mortem mutilation, her genitals disfigured in a manner that eerily mirrored a crime from 1974. The killer was evolving, becoming more brazen, more ritualistic in his violence. What happened next would cement the Monster of Florence's place in the annals of criminal history. For 4 terrifying years, the murders continued with horrifying regularity. Paolo Mainardi, 22, and Antonella Migliorini, 20, were shot with that same distinctive pistol and subjected to post-mortem disfigurement that had become the killer's signature. But in 1983, the monster deviated from his established pattern in a way that baffled investigators. His next targets weren't an Italian couple. They were 2 German male tourists, Horst Meyer and Uwe Rusch-Sens. Public speculation suggested they might have been a gay couple, though this theory remained unconfirmed and didn't significantly influence the investigation's direction. Italian authorities launched one of the most extensive investigations in the country's history. They questioned more than 100,000 individuals. Imagine that scale of investigation. 6 suspects were temporarily charged as law enforcement desperately sought to identify the monster terrorizing their region. The breakthrough seemed to come in January 1993, when attention focused on Pietro Pacciani, a 71-year-old semi-literate farmhand. Pacciani wasn't chosen at random. He had a documented history of violent crime, including previous convictions for murder and sexual assault. Despite his consistent proclamations of innocence, he was found guilty in November 1994 for 7 double murders associated with the Monster of Florence case. But here's where our story becomes even more complex, because the conviction of Pietro Pacciani was far from the end of this tale. In fact, it was just the beginning of an even deeper, more twisted conspiracy that would involve satanic cults, corrupt investigations, and theories so bizarre they sound like fiction. While investigators were focusing their attention on Pietro Pacciani, another suspect was lurking in the shadows of this case, a man whose violent history and disturbing behavior would make him a prime candidate for the title of Monster of Florence. His name was Salvatore Vinci, and his story begins with a suspicious death that authorities initially overlooked. Salvatore entered a room where his wife, Barbarina, lay in what appeared to be a suicide by gas inhalation. In the presence of his father-in-law and brother-in-law, Salvatore unlocked the door and proclaimed he could smell gas, though neither witness agreed with his observation. Inside, they found a propane tank near the bed with its valve open and tube extending directly into Barbarina's pillow. The setup looked like suicide, but several details didn't add up. Just hours earlier, the tank reportedly contained insufficient gas to heat milk. More disturbing were the bruises on Barbarina's neck and faint scratches on her face, signs that she might have resisted before succumbing to suffocation. Initially, these inconsistencies were ignored by the carabinieri, the medical examiner, and even Barbarina's friends. When the case was eventually revisited, investigators discovered that Salvatore had likely taken a .22 Beretta with him when he moved from Villa Cedro to Tuscany in 1961. They learned that Villa Cedro had 11.22 Beretta firearms that year, and one was reported stolen just before Salvatore's departure, a gun that had belonged to an elderly relative who had acquired it while working in Holland. However, an extensive Interpol investigation in Amsterdam failed to trace the weapon's origins further. But the real horror of Salvatore Vinci's character became apparent when investigators examined his life in Tuscany. His second wife, Rosina, provided testimony to the carabinieri that painted a picture of a man whose sexual proclivities were so extreme they would have impressed the infamous Marquis de Sade. What Rosina revealed about her marriage to Salvatore Vinci was a catalogue of sexual abuse, manipulation, and degradation that shocked even experienced investigators. Shortly after their marriage, Salvatore brought home a couple he claimed were overnight guests. When Rosina heard whispers from the guest room and discovered Salvatore in bed with these guests, her protests were met with rage. Salvatore forced her to bow before the couple and beg for forgiveness. This incident was just the beginning. Rosina described a pattern of forced sexual encounters orchestrated by Salvatore, who claimed such behavior was fashionable on the continent. She found herself coerced into sexual situations with strangers, often accompanied by physical abuse when she protested. One particularly disturbing account involved Salvatore and his friend Saverio, simultaneously engaging with her, later escalating to include their respective partners in various states of voyeuristic activity. The environment became increasingly toxic with the presence of Salvatore's young son, Antonio, also known as Antonello. Rosina lived in constant fear that the boy would be exposed to these sexual escapades and the violent fights that followed, potentially leaving lasting psychological scars. This portrait of Salvatore Vinci, a man capable of murdering his first wife and subjecting his second to systematic sexual abuse, created a compelling profile of someone who could be responsible for the Monster of Florence murders. His manipulative and coercive behavior, combined with his violent history and the mysterious circumstances surrounding that stolen Beretta, made him a prime suspect in the eyes of many investigators. By 1985, Judge Mario Rotella had become thoroughly convinced that Salvatore Vinci was the notorious Monster of Florence. As he examined the case files, Rotella grew increasingly frustrated with the missed opportunities to capture Vinci. One particularly glaring oversight occurred when police searched Vinci's residence following the 1984 Vicchio murder and discovered a blood-stained rag in a woman's straw bag. What happened next, or rather, what didn't happen, would haunt the investigation for years. This crucial piece of evidence had never been analyzed. When Judge Rotella discovered this oversight, he was outraged, viewing it as indicative of investigative negligence that bordered on the criminal. The prosecutor responsible attempted to justify the oversight, arguing it seemed implausible for a suspect to retain such blatant evidence. But Rotella was adamant about testing the rag. Unfortunately, the laboratory couldn't determine if the blood originated from one or two sources, and couldn't compare it to the victim's blood because samples weren't preserved. The rag was sent to a UK lab, which found it too degraded for analysis. Shockingly, even today, no plans exist to conduct DNA testing on this potentially crucial evidence. Rotella's frustration grew with each revelation of investigative incompetence. Despite being under close surveillance by the Carabinieri, Vinci repeatedly evaded his watchers using tactics as simple as running red lights. Even worse, surveillance inexplicably ceased during the weekend of the Scopeti clearing double homicide, allowing Vinci to move without detection. Rotella firmly believed these tragedies could have been prevented if proper surveillance had been maintained. On June 11, 1986, Judge Rotella made a strategic decision that would change the course of the investigation. He ordered Vinci's arrest, not for the Monster of Florence murders, but for the 1961 murder of his wife, Barbarina. Rotella's plan was ingenious: secure a conviction in this seemingly straightforward case, then use it as leverage to prosecute Vinci as the Monster of Florence. And here's the crucial detail that seemed to vindicate Rotella's theory. During the 2 years Vinci was incarcerated while the judge built his case for Barbarina's murder, the Monster of Florence did not commit a single murder. The killings stopped completely. But just when it seemed the case might be resolved, everything changed. The trial of Pietro Pacciani created a crisis of confidence in the investigation. There was growing apprehension among law enforcement about the potential repercussions if Pacciani were declared innocent. The prospect of his release loomed large, threatening severe embarrassment and reputational damage to the police and their investigative competency. It was in this precarious context that Chief Inspector Michel Giuttari assumed command of the Monster of Florence case in October 1995. Giuttari cut an arresting figure, hailing from Messina, Sicily. He was often seen with his distinctive half-smoked cigar, upturned coat collar, and sleek black hair. Bearing a resemblance to Al Pacino's character in Scarface, he exuded drama, conducting himself as though perpetually in the spotlight. Giuttari wasn't just a police officer. He harbored aspirations as a novelist and held a fascination for intricate conspiracy theories. He established his command in an office with a panoramic view of the Arno River near the American Embassy, taking over from Chief Inspector Ruggero Perugini, who had moved to Washington, D.C. The new Chief Inspector faced a daunting task: combing through tens of thousands of case files, including myriad witness interviews, expert reports, technical analyses, and detailed trial transcripts. He meticulously revisited all evidence from the various crime scenes, and what he discovered would take the case in an entirely new direction. As Giuttari delved deeper into the files, he uncovered numerous lingering questions, unresolved evidence, and perplexing mysteries. This led him to a crucial realization: the case was far from being satisfactorily resolved. Not even his predecessor had fully grasped the terrifying scope and complexity of what they were dealing with. During his intensive review, Giuttari unearthed critical evidence that had previously escaped notice. This evidence hinted at something far more sinister than the actions of a lone serial killer. It suggested a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Italian society. Chief Inspector Giuttari's investigation led him down a path that would have seemed impossible to earlier investigators. He became convinced that the Monster of Florence murders were not the work of individual killers, but rather part of an elaborate satanic conspiracy involving wealthy and influential figures from society's highest echelons. According to Giuttari's theory, this malevolent association comprised a clandestine assembly of powerful individuals entrenched in business, law, and medicine. These shadowy figures had allegedly employed Pacciani, Vanni, and Lodi as executioners to slay couples and harvest female sex organs for use as ritualistic wafers in black mass ceremonies. To pursue this extraordinary theory, Giuttari established a specialized police unit known as the Gruppo Investigativo Delitti Seriali, GIDES. the Serial Killings Investigative Group. This elite cadre operated out of Il Magnifico, a substantial concrete edifice near Florence Airport, dedicated solely to unmasking the masterminds allegedly orchestrating the murders from the shadows. Guattari found what he believed was compelling evidence for his satanic cult theory. A seemingly trivial remark by Lottie that a doctor had enlisted Pacciani for some minor tasks reignited suspicions of medical professionals' involvement, not as direct killers but as intellectual architects of the murders. Even more intriguing was Pacciani's mysterious wealth. Posthumously, investigators discovered he owned 2 properties and held post office bonds valued at over $100,000. The sources of such affluence remained enigmatic. Rather than attributing this to Italy's largely undisclosed economy of the time, Guattari gravitated toward a more sinister hypothesis. Pacciani's fortune was accumulated through the horrific trade of body parts collected over years of murder. In his comprehensive account of the case, Guattari detailed his theory about the satanic practices motivating the monster's actions. According to his hypothesis, human sacrifices were the ultimate means of summoning demonic entities, particularly effective when executed during sexual climax, a phenomenon known as mors justi. This rationale supposedly motivated the monster to strike couples during intimate moments, capturing the surge of energies released during orgasm to empower dark rituals. As if the case wasn't complex enough, another theory emerged that captured public imagination. Could the Monster of Florence actually be a man of God? A letter sent to La Nazione newspaper suggested that the killer might be a monk or priest. The writer theorized that the old, discolored shell casings found at murder scenes indicated an outdated firearm and ammunition that had been abandoned in a dusty monastery corner for years. The letter referenced prevalent discussions among Florence residents that the murderer could resemble a priest like Savonarola, inflicting divine punishment on youth for their immoral behaviors. Supporting this biblical interpretation, the writer noted that the first victim had a piece of grapevine inserted into her body, possibly a reference to Jesus' words about unproductive vines being cut away. Law enforcement took this theory seriously and began discreetly investigating priests known for peculiar habits. Local prostitutes provided a crucial lead, informing police about a priest who occasionally sought their services, not for typical reasons, but to shave off their pubic hair, a service for which he paid handsomely. This detail intrigued investigators, who saw potential evidence of someone with a proclivity for using razors, aligning with the killer's modus operandi. One chilly Sunday morning, plainclothes police officers and carabinieri, accompanied by magistrates, made their way to a time-worn country church nestled among cypresses in the picturesque hills southwest of Florence. They found the priest in the sacristy, donning ceremonial robes for Mass. When presented with the search warrant, the priest was visibly shaken, nearly collapsing. While he didn't deny his secret hobby of hair removal, he vehemently denied being the Monster of Florence. He pleaded for discretion and requested that the search be postponed until after Mass. The authorities agreed, attending the service themselves while vigilantly watching for any attempt to destroy evidence. As we reach the end of our journey through this labyrinthine case, we're left with more questions than answers. The Monster of Florence case represents everything that can go wrong in a criminal investigation. Crucial evidence ignored or lost, multiple competing theories, investigative incompetence, and conspiracy theories that seem to multiply rather than resolve the central mystery. Was Pietro Pacciani truly the Monster of Florence? Or was he simply a convenient scapegoat with a violent past? Did Salvatore Vinci's imprisonment really coincide with the end of the murders, making him the true killer? Or was Chief Inspector Guattari correct in his belief that the murders were orchestrated by a satanic cult of wealthy and powerful individuals? The truth about the Monster of Florence may never be fully known. What we do know is that between 1968 and 1985, at least 16 people lost their lives to a killer or killers who terrorized the Tuscan countryside. The beautiful landscapes that once attracted lovers and tourists became scenes of unimaginable horror. The decades of terror transformed Florence from a haven for nature enthusiasts and romantic couples into a chilling backdrop of fear. Even after multiple convictions and countless investigations, doubts persist about whether the real culprit or culprits were ever brought to justice. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case is how it reveals the capacity for evil to hide in plain sight. Whether in the form of a violent farmhand, a manipulative Sardinian immigrant, a corrupt physician, or even a man of God. The Monster of Florence case reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are often those who walk among us, hidden behind masks of normalcy. As the Tuscan sun dips behind the hills, the Monster of Florence remains one of Italy's darkest mysteries. Lives cut short, families broken, and a trail of unanswered questions. More than a tale of a killer, it's a story of investigations gone awry, ego, missteps, and conspiracy that sometimes feel more monstrous than the crimes themselves. If you think you know the story, think again. New threads in the case suggest there's more hidden in the archives than anyone admitted. Curious which leads were ignored, which pieces never saw the light, and what fresh evidence might still rewrite the narrative. Listen to the full episode for the full archival deep dive, witness accounts, and the twists that didn't make the headlines. Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story. Exclusive material and extended interviews await. Until next time, remember, the most frightening monsters often hide in plain sight.